Now that we understand some of the details of GDP, it's kind of helpful to compare this to another alternative that we call GNP, Gross National Product. So, why do I care about this? Well, in a lot of these previous examples here, we were dealing with imports and exports. And in the smartphone example, we had, production taking place in different parts of the world. So to give you an example, right, Honda Motor Company, is a Japanese-owned company. It produces cars in the U.S. and sells them here, right? So think of, a Honda. Some of them are imported from Japan. They're assembled in Japan, imported here, but some of them are actually assembled in the U.S. and they're sold here, so they're going to count as part of U.S. GDP. So, the question is, should we count it as U.S. GDP, right? By our definition of GDP, yes. It's produced here, sold here, therefore it's going to count as part of GDP. But you can kind of see the nature of the question, right? Is that really something of value produced by the United States when it was a company owned by citizens of another country? Same thing is true on the other side, right? Apple is a company that is US based, its owners are US based, and it makes and sells iPhones in China. If it produces the iPhone in China and sells it in China, it's going to count as part of China's GDP. But you could argue that perhaps that should be accounted for in terms of US total production, right? So, how do we keep track of these differences? And this alternative is gross national product, GNP. And really, we just take the GDP, what was produced in the US, I add to it anything that was produced by US owned capital. That would be like Apple making something in China and selling it there. And we subtract out production of foreign owned companies and labor in the US. That would be the example of Honda in my previous example. So if we do that, then we're really just keeping track of ownership, right? What is produced by US owned resources versus what is produced in the US. So let's do an example. This is kind of good review of everything. And I have all this information here of consumption, government purchases, investment, exports, imports. And I also know something about income or production value of workers in different countries. Okay, so let's first start with GDP. Is going to be the addition of consumption, 850, plus my investment, 630, plus my government purchases, which is 900, plus my net exports, which are going to be my exports, 260, minus my imports, which are 300. So my GDP is going to be, I get 2,340, if I did that correct, with the minus 40 for imports. Okay, so let's think about our GNP then, gross national product. So we wanted this to say, well, how much of this or what in total was produced by US owned resources? And so I'm going to take GDP to calculate GNP. I'm going to take my GDP, which is 2340. I'm going to add to it the value of output produced by US residents in another country. So that would be salaries earned by US residents abroad. That was 350. So it's 350 million in this example, right? So we're up to 2690. But then I'm going to subtract out the income earned or amount of goods and services produced by other citizens that did so in the U.S. That was 160, right? So that's all we have to do to get to GDP or GNP. We take GDP, add in the production of U.S.-based resources in other countries, and we subtract out the production of foreign-owned capital in the U.S. And that gets us to 2,530. Would be my total GNP, gross national product. Okay, so it's really just keeping track of where the resource is owned and what was produced in the U.S. or by U.S. citizens in another country. Okay, so does it really matter? Probably not. In the end, so here's just kind of a picture. The blue line here plots our GDP, and the red line plots our GNP, which is everything produced by U.S.-owned resources. So, we can see that, if we use GNP as the measure, we produce a little bit more by U.S.-owned resources than what's included in GDP, but the difference is relatively small. And more importantly, the difference is pretty much constant. And so that kind of tells me that it doesn't really matter which one that I use in particular. And we're not going to really care too much. So I bring up GNP so you know what it is, because you'll hear people refer to that. And now you know exactly what it is, and you can make the calculations pretty easily given the right set of information. Okay, so that is our learning objective 4, comparing GDP and GNP, and we will now move on to an important topic of real versus nominal quantities.